President John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address in 1961, pledged that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. In that same address, he later asked, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." As we consider the American military forces during the Cold War, millions of Americans served in the military, defending freedom in wars and conflicts that were not always popular. Many were killed and even more were wounded. The nation was most shaken when President John F. Kennedy, a World War II veteran, was assassinated in 1963 in Dallas. In an event that shook the nation's confidence, that began an era of internal strife and a great deal of divisiveness, especially spurred by divisions over U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Speaking of the Vietnam War, we have to consider how were these veterans welcomed home. Unlike veterans from World War II, who returned to a very grateful and supportive nation, the veterans from Vietnam returned to face oftentimes indifference or sometimes outright hostility from some who opposed the war. We finally recognized that the war was over, but it was not until several years after the end of the war in 1973 that the wounds began to heal in America, and when Vietnam veterans were finally recognized and honored for their services and sacrifices. In many cases, this began 10, even 15 years after the end of the Vietnam War. But the final victory was ours. As a result of the service of these American veterans, the ideals of democracy and freedom ultimately prevailed in the Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union and its brand of communism. Technology, quite simply put, is the application of science. And we have seen dramatic increases in technology that have affected American life in many significant areas. The American space program was a triumph of American technological prowess, and technology has made communication and information much more accessible to many more people. It all really kicks off with the race to space, with the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. You see, in the early 1960s, after America had fallen behind in the space race to the evil Soviet Union, President John F. Kennedy pledged that by the end of the 1960s, by the end of the decade, America would successfully land a man on the moon and return him safely to home. And so the race was on to the moon. And that lasted through the entire 1960s. While America fell behind with the first person in space, the first person to orbit, and the first satellite, we did win the race to the moon. America's first astronaut to go into outer space was John Glenn, as the first American to orbit the world. In 1969, in August of 1969, the United States finally won the race to the moon with astronaut Neil Armstrong, who became the first person to leave the Earth and step foot on the moon. As he made his triumphant climb down the ladder of the lunar module, he proclaimed, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Yes, humanity had now gone to the moon. We planted our flag and placed our footsteps firmly there.